Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I never liked my parents' neighbors, but for a long time I didn't think much about it. Everyone has that one annoying family on their street. The ones who don't mow the lawn or park their cars wherever they please. But this family was different. It wasn't just that they were rude or inconsiderate. It was like they went out of their way to be a problem. The wife especially, she was the kind of person who could turn anything into a fight. My parents have lived in that house for over 25 years. It's an old two-story home with blue siding and a wide front porch. The kind of place that looks comfortable, even if you're just walking by. The neighborhood itself is quiet. Mostly retired couples, a few families, nothing too fancy, but nice enough to make you feel safe. Then about 10 years ago, the neighbors from hell moved in next door. They had 2 kids, both in school back then, and the first sign of how they'd be came early in the mornings. Around 6:30, before the sun even rose, the wife would sit in their driveway and lay on the horn of her car. She wouldn't stop until her kids came outside. Every morning, you'd hear this harsh, repetitive honking echo through the street, while everyone else was still asleep. The sound would cut through the air like something sharp. Sometimes it would go on for minutes, and my mom would stand at the kitchen window, just staring in disbelief. At first, my parents thought it might be a one-time thing. Maybe she was in a hurry. But it happened again the next day, and the day after that, and pretty soon it was just part of the routine. The whole neighborhood complained quietly to each other, but no one said anything directly. My mom, being who she is, kind, patient, but also someone who believes in basic decency, finally decided to go talk to her about it. She walked over one morning after another session of honking, just to ask politely if they could refrain from doing it so early. That's when everything started to change. It wasn't just a refusal. The woman seemed to take it as a personal attack. The honking didn't stop, it got worse. Not only would she honk for her kids every morning, but then her husband and even the kids themselves started doing it every time they left the house. They'd pull out of the driveway and hit the horn several times in a row. Long, drawn-out honks that echoed through the neighborhood. They made sure everyone heard them. It was so obvious they were doing it out of spite. It became their little game. Every time my mom looked out the window, she'd see one of them glance toward our house before pressing the horn. It got to the point where I could recognize the sound of their car's horn anywhere. I'd be visiting my parents on a weekend morning, sitting at the dining table with coffee, and that sharp, angry sound would cut through everything. It always made me tense. My dad would mutter under his breath, shake his head, and try to ignore it, but I could tell it bothered him too. That was the first layer of tension that settled between the houses. The next one came a couple of years later, when the neighbor decided to accuse my parents of having their garden on her property. The garden had been there for decades. My mom planted tomatoes, bell peppers, and some herbs along the side of the fence. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small patch of green that she took care of every spring. The same spot, same layout year after year. Then one day, out of nowhere, the neighbor came stomping across the yard, yelling that the garden was on her land. My parents didn't even engage at first. They figured it was another one of her mood swings. But a few days later, a surveyor showed up. She had actually hired one. The man spent an afternoon marking out the exact lines of the property. When he was done, it turned out the garden was about 4 inches over the property line. 4 inches. You could barely see the difference unless you were looking straight down from above. My dad even joked that the neighbor probably spent more money on the surveyor than the entire garden was worth. But she didn't care. That tiny detail was enough to send her completely over the edge. The next morning, she spray-painted a neon orange line right across the grass. It was so bright it almost glowed, cutting between the 2 properties like a wound. Then she came out with a shovel and started digging up the edge of the garden. She destroyed the outer row of plants and ripped out the little wooden border my mom had built years ago. After that, she put up a small decorative fence, one of those knee-high metal ones people usually use for flower beds, and ran it right along the line she'd spray-painted. It looked ridiculous, like something from a cartoon. The worst part wasn't even the fence itself. It was what she did afterward. She started keeping their trash bins right up against that little fence, right where the garden used to be. It was nowhere near their back door or garage, so every trash day, they'd have to drag those bins across their yard just to get them to the curb. It made no sense except as a way to spite my parents. It was like she wanted to turn that small corner of the yard into some kind of battleground. The smell in the summer was awful. On hot days when the sun beat down on the black plastic lids, the air around the property line would reek. My mom tried to ignore it, but I could tell it got to her. Every time she went out to water the plants, she'd glance over at those bins, sitting right there where her garden used to be. And I could see the disappointment in her face. Things got worse when the neighbors started making accusations. Out of nowhere, she claimed my parents were throwing dog waste into her yard. My parents don't even have a dog. They never have, but the neighbor did. 3 small wiener dogs that barked constantly. They didn't get walked much. They mostly stayed in the yard, running around in circles and barking at anyone who passed by. The smell coming from that side of the fence was bad enough that you didn't even want to sit outside sometimes. When she accused my mom of tossing dog waste over the fence, it was almost laughable, but then she took it too far. One afternoon, she came storming over, screaming at the top of her lungs. My dad ended up dealing with her because my mom was too shaken to even open the door. He said the woman was shouting nonsense, accusing my mom of plotting against them, of trying to sabotage their house. She kept pointing toward the fence and ranting about conspiracies and how everyone in the neighborhood was turning against her. My dad said her eyes looked wild, like she hadn't slept in days. After that, things shifted. It wasn't just irritation anymore. It started to feel unsettling. Like maybe this woman wasn't just mean or petty. Maybe something was wrong with her. There were small signs at first. Random lights turning on and off at odd hours next door. The sound of doors slamming in the middle of the night. Once when I was visiting, I saw her standing in her front yard around midnight, just staring at our house. No phone, no cigarette, no reason to be there. Just standing completely still, arms crossed. When she noticed me watching from the window, she turned and walked back inside without a word. The husband was quieter, but there was something off about him too. He never smiled, never said hello. Just a blank stare every time we crossed paths. The kids grew up and moved out eventually, which somehow made things worse. Without them around, the couple seemed to spiral even more. A few years ago, my parents thought things might settle down. The honking had become less frequent, maybe because they weren't leaving early for school anymore. But then it started again, this time at random hours. Sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of the day. They'd back their cars out of the driveway, stop for a second, and lay on the horn 3 or 4 times. It was like a message, like they were reminding us that they were still there. The neighborhood association tried to intervene once when someone complained about the fence and the spray paint line, but nothing really came of it. Apparently, because it was such a small fence and technically on their side, there wasn't much that could be done. The trash bins stayed, the orange line faded but never disappeared completely. And the hostility just became a permanent background noise in my parents' lives. Over time, I started noticing how much it changed them. My mom stopped tending to the garden altogether. The area where the plants used to grow turned into a patch of dirt and weeds. My dad stopped sitting out on the porch in the evenings. He used to love that. Just sitting with a beer after work, listening to crickets and watching the light fade. But now he said it didn't feel relaxing anymore. It's hard to enjoy peace when you feel like you're being watched. Whenever I'd visit, I'd notice little things. Footprints near the edge of the fence, not ours. Bits of trash that didn't belong in our yard. Once there was a small pile of gravel that looked like it had been dumped deliberately near the property line. Another time I found a set of plastic forks stabbed into the ground in a line along the fence, like someone marking something. None of it made sense, but it all added to that feeling that something was brewing. The worst part was how unpredictable she became. You never knew what would set her off. One day she'd be sitting in her driveway waving at cars that passed, acting completely normal. And the next, she'd be stomping around her yard shouting to herself. My mom once saw her standing on a ladder near the fence, pointing her phone down into our yard, as if she was taking photos or videos. When my mom went outside to ask what she was doing, the woman scrambled down and ran back inside without saying anything. By then, my parents had stopped trying to reason with her. They just kept their distance, stayed polite when necessary, and tried to avoid any confrontation. But I could see the toll it took on them. Living next to someone like that wears you down. It's not like a single big event, it's a slow erosion. Last year, when I went over to help with some yard work, I noticed something new. Along the property line where the orange paint had once been, there were now little wooden stakes with reflective tape on top. She had driven them into the ground about every 2 feet, forming a bright, jagged border between the houses. It looked awful, but what really got to me was how deliberate it was. Every single stake was perfectly lined up, straight and even. It must have taken her hours. I asked my dad about it, and he just shrugged, said she must have done it at night. Neither of them had seen her putting them in. That thought stuck with me. The image of her out there after dark, quietly hammering stakes into the ground, one by one. Then a few months later, she disappeared for a bit. No honking, no screaming, no signs of life except for the husband's car coming and going. My parents said it was quiet for almost 3 weeks. Peaceful even. They thought maybe she was visiting family or something. But when she came back, it was worse than ever. The honking returned, louder and more frequent. She started yelling again, though no one could make out what she was saying most of the time. Sometimes she'd stand in her yard, arms crossed, staring at our house, muttering under her breath. The fence got a new coat of paint, black this time, and she added a private property sign facing directly toward us, even though the area was clearly part of her own yard. It was around then that my parents started talking seriously about moving. They're older now, both retired, and I think the idea of dealing with that kind of constant tension just became too much. It's not an easy thing, though, selling a house you've lived in for 25 years because of a neighbor. But when peace of mind starts slipping away, you start thinking about what it's worth. The last time I visited, the air between the two houses felt thick, like something invisible but heavy. The reflective stakes were still there, glinting in the sunlight. The trash bins sat neatly lined along the fence. The smell was still bad, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a car horn echoed, sharp, deliberate, and familiar. It's strange how something so small, like a few honks in the morning or a spray-painted line, can grow into years of quiet warfare. No shouting matches, no police reports, just a slow, constant erosion of normal life. My parents don't say much about it anymore, but I can see it on their faces every time they look toward that side of the yard. Sometimes I wonder if that neighbor even realizes how much damage she's done, or if she just lives in her own world, convinced she's defending something that was never under attack. Maybe it's paranoia, maybe it's bitterness, maybe it's just who she is, but whatever it is, it's enough to make a home feel like a place you need to escape from. When I left my parents' house that evening, I looked over one last time at the fence and saw her standing there again, near the trash bins, just staring. The setting sun hit her face in a way that made it hard to read her expression. She didn't move, didn't wave, just watched me as I got in my car and pulled away. The sound of a horn echoed behind me as I turned the corner out of the cul-de-sac. I didn't even look back. We lived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where people mowed on Saturdays and waved at each other in passing. The house had a small porch, a swing that never got used, and a yard that sloped just enough to catch afternoon sun. My parents worked, so the yard and the dogs were part of how the house felt alive when nobody was home. We had 2 dogs, a rescued collie with a long, rough coat, and an old Shetland sheepdog who was all teeth and nervous energy. The collie moved like a ghost when she wanted to, quiet, careful, always watching. The Sheltie was the sort who yipped at anything that moved. A small, thin bundle of sound who warned the world about the mailman, the wind, birds, the neighbor's cat, and anything else that dared cross the fence. The old man next door was the kind of person whose face you would remember less than his habits. He kept his yard bare and his porch swept, and he had an opinion about anything that made a noise after dawn. At first it was small things. A note tucked under our door asking us to control our dog's barking. Another with more urgent handwriting about noise. My parents tried to be polite. We started bringing the Sheltie in during the day and tried to keep the collie inside when we could. Dogs bark. That's the bottom line. Still, the old man kept leaving notes, and sometimes he would stand at his window and watch. He would mutter to himself when he thought no one could hear. He would slam his blinds shut, walk to his car, and leave in a hurry. There was a tension to him, the kind that sat like static under ordinary days. One late summer afternoon, we left for work and errands, and, because we had been careful for weeks, we left both dogs in the yard with the gate latched. The afternoon was sticky, and a breeze moved the leaves in bright patches. When we came home, the gate squealed in a wrong way, and we saw the yard like someone else's, because the blades of grass were dotted with small silver heads that glinted like fish scales. Nails. Short, stubby nails had been pushed headfirst into the ground all over the front lawn, almost like someone planted a crop of tiny metal mushrooms. My stomach dropped. At first the smell didn't hit, just the stupid, cruel geometry of the thing. Then we looked at the dogs. They limped slower than before. There were punctures in their paws, and a few nails had lodged shallow in pads. The Sheltie yelped and kept lifting her paw like it wasn't supposed to be there. The collie stood with her head down and eyes heavy with shock. Blood was small and precise, not the kind of wide mess that stays in the memory like a bad movie, but private and close. I had never seen my dad move so fast. He grabbed the dogs and carried them inside, cleaned the wounds, wrapped paws in gauze while his hands shook, and then walked over to the neighbor's house without asking anyone's permission. When he came back, his face was hard and the old man's car was gone. The old man moved away within weeks. There were no sweet apologies, no confessions written in the open. The house sat quiet for a while. Then a moving truck took him and whatever grudges he packed. My dogs healed. The collie limped a little longer than before, and would watch the edges of our property like a soldier on duty. The Sheltie eventually stopped yelping at birds and took comfort in the shade. We planted flowers over the places where the nails had been, like small flags to mark endings and new green things. Years passed and life shifted us across state lines. New jobs, new schools, new rhythms. But the pattern was stubborn. We found ourselves once again beside someone who seemed to think the world owed him obedience. The new man was smaller and younger than the first, but he carried the same small, sour arrogance. He took his tiny breed dogs, Yorkies with hair like tassels, and walked them with a kind of casual disrespect. They moved through yards as if they were missiles, and he let them go wherever they liked. People talked and frowned and asked him to pick up after them. He shrugged. Laws and manners mean less to some people than convenience. My old lab, a gentle dog who had been with me since she was a puppy, was older now. Hip dysplasia had made her slow and clumsy, but she still loved sun on her back and a soft patch of grass where she could lay and think dog thoughts. One golden afternoon I picked her up, carried her to the lawn and set her down so she could feel the warmth through her fur. She answered me with a slow, contented sigh and tucked her chin into her paws. When she tried to rise, she hobbled and rocked, but she always tried. She had a kind face that made strangers smile, and strangers had, over the years, reached out to rub her head. She was harmless. That was the simplest fact. The Yorkies came barreling down the path with their man behind them, and the old habit of standing still to let dogs meet each other felt right. My lab wobbled up and sniffed the little dogs, tail a fast, slow metronome of joy. There was no bite, no raised hackles, just the soft curiosity of an old dog who had forgotten that she could not travel the way she used to. The man did not pull his dogs back. Instead, He crossed into our yard. Then everything tilted. He shoved at my lab with one foot, and the sound it made in my ears is a sound I still hear when I close my eyes. The dog lost balance and fell. A slow tumble that did not match the cruelty of the shove. He scooped his Yorkies up and held them like trophies. He yelled at me, a sharp voice that wanted to make me small and ashamed. The words did not matter. What mattered was what he had done. He had stepped into my yard and hurt my dog. He had crossed a line I had not thought existed in the world of polite neighbor gripes. I was 15 and I was furious in a way that unhooked me from fear. I moved like something pulled by the only string left taut. My hand hit his face. It was not precise, not measured, just hard and honest and the kind of thing that left no room for words. His jaw went crooked and he staggered back as if surprised by his own sudden emptiness of grievance. I said things to him that felt like teeth, promises that lived in my rib cage like hot coal. I threatened with words meant to protect the small who could not stand for themselves. The man collected himself and left, muttering and clutching his cheek. The Yorkies yapped and yapped, more outraged by the sudden lack of attention than by anything else. After that, the neighborhood changed the way water changes a riverbed. People had seen the shove or the punch or the scene walking past. Or they had heard the story that turned small events into a local legend. Some looked at me differently, with a mix of respect and surprise you get when a quiet thing snaps. Others kept out of it, because there are people who prefer the safety of not being involved. My parents were angry, but not in the way my heart was. They were practical. Calls were made, hands were washed, apologies were demanded. The man apologized to no one. He walked the other way if he saw us on the sidewalk. The Yorkies continued their routes, but with a new boundary drawn in invisible chalk. My yard was not his. My lab recovered from that day with a stubbornness that belongs to animals and old women. She still limped, still needed help sometimes, but she lay in the sun more often and slept with her head on a porch step like a king. The collie became a lookout, and the Sheltie learned to keep to the shade and bark only when the mailman turned the corner. We fixed our fence and planted larger thorny bushes by the edge of the yard, so the kind of crossing that had happened could not happen again easily. No police reports, no long court fights, just small, firm changes that built a wall around our peace. Time does something that feels like healing. The memory of the nails in the yard sits beside the memory of the shove and the punch, and neither feels like a distant myth. They are parts of the life that taught me how sharply people can harm, and how firmly a person can stand for what matters. I learned to be loud enough when I had to be, to call out cruelty even at the cost of being the awkward one on the block. My lab died years later with the sun on her face and my hand in hers. I said the things I needed to say without anyone hearing. I buried her in a corner of the yard where the grass grew taller than anywhere else, and I planted a row of lavender so the air would always smell like softness there. The old man who kicked my dog kept to his own walkways for a long time after. He left eventually like the other one, in a small truck with boxes stacked badly in the back. No grand apology, no explanation. When new people moved in, they asked about the neighborhood, and I told them the honest, small version. Some people will be cruel, and sometimes cruelty will be stopped by someone who refuses to stand down. That was the clean, clear end I needed. The dogs were safe. The yard stayed a place of sun and shade, and when the world leaned against me with unfairness, I learned that there were moments when you had to rise and meet it head on. That is how it ended, with the dogs warm in the sun, the man gone, the fence mended, and a lavender row carrying the smell of better days through the neighborhood in late afternoons. I kept walking by that yard, feeling the ground under my feet, knowing the limits I would set and the ones I would not cross. The lesson stayed simple and true. Protect what you love and do it without regret. When I first moved into that apartment, I thought I had lucked out. It was small, quiet, and on the cheaper side, but it was clean and decent enough for what I could afford. It was my first real place since moving out on my own, and I was just getting used to being by myself. The complex wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't terrible either. Just a lot of young people, single parents and older tenants who'd been there for years. The walls were thin, and you could always hear something faint through them, TVs, arguments, babies crying, the sound of someone vacuuming too late at night. The lady next door moved differently than most people around there. She was loud but friendly. She introduced herself the second day after I moved in. She had 3 kids, all under 10, and she looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. She told me she was a single mom trying to get her life together. She seemed nice enough, and I didn't have any reason to think otherwise. We'd talk sometimes in the hallway or outside while getting the mail. A few weeks in, she invited me over for drinks. I figured it would be good to know someone nearby, so I went. Her apartment looked like a storm had hit it. Toys everywhere, dishes piled high, and a smell of sour milk and cigarettes that lingered in the air. She brushed it off like it was normal. We sat on her old couch while her kids ran around barefoot, and she poured me cheap vodka mixed with orange juice. We laughed about random things for a few hours. She was funny, rough around the edges but not mean. I left that night thinking she was just a stressed-out mom trying her best. After that, she'd knock on my door sometimes, asking if I wanted to hang out. I didn't mind. We'd have drinks once a week or so. Sometimes her kids would be up way too late, but I didn't say anything. One night, after a few drinks, she asked if I could watch the kids for an hour while she ran out. She said she'd pay me. It didn't seem like a big deal, so I agreed. An hour turned into 4. I had to put the kids to bed myself because it was getting late. When she finally came home, she was so drunk she could barely stand. I didn't even bring up the money she'd promised. I just went home and tried to forget about it. But it didn't stop there. She started showing up at my door more often, dropping her kids off without warning. She'd say something about needing to run to the store or meet someone, and then she'd disappear for hours. Every time she came back hammered, I started avoiding her completely, keeping my lights off, not answering knocks, pretending I wasn't home. A couple weeks later, I came home from class and saw her hosting a full-blown party in the hallway. Music was blasting, people were drinking, and she was right in the middle of it all. She saw me and yelled for me to come join. I hesitated, but eventually I gave in. I sat down with a drink, trying to stay polite. Within an hour, half the people were passed out or gone. She was sitting on the floor, holding her baby in one arm, snorting something off a compact mirror and drinking straight from a bottle with the other. It got bad fast. She suddenly vomited all over the carpet and nearly dropped her baby. I caught the baby before she hit the ground. She passed out right there on her side, breathing heavy and unresponsive. The smell of vomit filled the room. I didn't know what to do, so I made sure she was still breathing, then gathered her kids, made them something simple to eat, and put them in bed. Then I went back to my own place. After that night, things just spiraled. I'd hear the kids crying through the walls sometimes. Other nights, I'd hear her yelling, things slamming. Once, I woke up at 2 a.m. to one of the kids knocking softly on my door. When I opened it, the oldest, about 8, was standing there holding the baby, saying their mom was gone. I brought them inside, fed them cereal, let them sit on the couch and watch TV until she finally stumbled home hours later. I didn't say anything, but the same thing happened again. And again, the last time it happened, I decided I was done. The kids came over in the middle of the day saying they hadn't eaten since morning. I called their mom and told her she had 15 minutes to come home. She didn't answer. I waited an hour, then told myself I wasn't letting this go on anymore. I had CPS saved in my contacts and I was ready to call. Just as I picked up my phone, she showed up, completely disheveled, smelling of alcohol and cigarettes. I told her she needed to take care of her kids and left it at that. About a week later, my roommate texted me while I was at school. He said she had broken into our apartment. She thought no one was home, but he was there. He said she acted like she was looking for something, but when he told her to leave, she ran off. After that, I noticed $100 missing from my dresser, plus a pair of my heels and a jar of coins I kept by the door. It wasn't even a question, it was her. That night around 11, there was a knock. It was her kids again. They said their mom was gone. I went next door, knocked, and no one answered. The door was unlocked. The place was a disaster. Broken glass on the kitchen floor, a pan still sitting on a hot burner, and the baby crying in her crib, her diaper so old it was stuck to her. It was clear they'd been left alone for hours. My roommate and I didn't even hesitate. We called CPS and the police. When the police showed up, they took one look at that apartment and lost it. The kids were hungry, dirty, and scared. They sat quietly on my couch while I told the officers everything I'd seen over the past few months. Her drinking, leaving the kids alone, breaking into my place. The officers stayed until she came home. When she finally walked up the stairs, she looked surprised to see the cops waiting. Within seconds, she was shouting, slurring, stumbling. She tried to push past them, and they slammed her against the hood of the car and cuffed her. I watched from my window as she kicked and screamed. It was sad, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was finally over. Later that night, one of the officers came back upstairs. He said she was trying to claim I was supposed to be watching the kids, trying to pin it on me. I told him absolutely not, that I had already warned her I wouldn't do it anymore. He nodded and said she'd been drunk on arrival and had prior charges for neglect and theft. She's been in jail since December. The police told me her kids were taken in by their grandparents. A few weeks later, I got word through a mutual neighbor that the kids were doing great. The baby was healthy, and the older ones were going to school and adjusting well. Sometimes I still think about those nights when I'd hear them crying through the walls. It makes me sick that it went on for as long as it did. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't finally called. The apartment next to mine is empty now. The doors shut tight, the windows dark. The smell that used to drift from under her door, booze, smoke, and dirty diapers, is gone. It's quiet again. Every once in a while, I'll see a maintenance worker go in there, probably cleaning up the mess she left behind. I'll catch myself staring at that door, thinking about how fast things can fall apart behind closed walls. She seemed like a normal neighbor at first, just another person trying to make it through. But under all of that, she was drowning, and she dragged those kids down with her until someone finally stepped in. Now, when I come home from class, I walk past that door without even looking. The quiet feels heavy but peaceful. I lock my door every night, not because I'm scared of her coming back, but because it reminds me that sometimes real danger isn't from strangers or dark alleys. It's from the people living 10 feet away, on the other side of the wall. When I was growing up, the house next door was owned by an older man named Mr. Harlan. He was the kind of neighbor you wish everyone had. Every Saturday morning, he'd come over with a small tin of cookies or sometimes a jar of homemade jam, and he'd sit on the porch with my parents, talking for hours over coffee. He was quiet, polite, and never complained about anything. He kept his house neat, freshly painted shutters, trimmed hedges, a small garden in the back that he tended to every morning at sunrise. His wife had died years before, but he kept things exactly as she had left them. You could see her touch everywhere. The white lace curtains, the wind chime by the kitchen window, the bird bath surrounded by pink azaleas. Even as a kid, I could tell that his home carried a kind of calm that made the rest of the street feel safe. Then one day, he was gone. It wasn't sudden. He had been getting slower, thinner, quieter, but one Saturday he didn't come by. My mom went to check on him, and that was that. He'd passed in his sleep, and within a month the house went up for sale. For a while it just sat there. The grass started to grow high, the flowers wilted, and the paint began to peel. It was strange seeing his house that way, like it had lost its heartbeat. When the for sale sign finally disappeared, a moving truck showed up early one morning. I remember standing by our living room window, watching a family unload their furniture. There was a man, a woman, 2 kids, and another man who we assumed was the husband's brother. They looked normal enough, smiling, waving. The kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalk while the adults carried boxes inside. For the first few weeks it was quiet. They introduced themselves once, and that was the end of it. The lawn got mowed, the curtains went up, and everything seemed fine. Then the noise started. At first, it was just loud music on a Friday night. My dad brushed it off, said it was just a housewarming thing. But the next night it happened again, louder this time. By the third weekend, it became clear it wasn't just a one-time thing. The party started every Friday evening and didn't stop until nearly sunrise on Monday. Cars lined both sides of the street. Strangers walked across our lawn. The bass from the music rattled our windows and vibrated through the walls. Even with the windows closed, the sound was constant. Voices shouting. Laughter, engines revving, dogs barking, bottles breaking. My parents tried to sleep through it, but the noise was impossible to ignore. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and hear people yelling outside, sometimes fighting. The next morning, our front yard would be littered with beer cans, cigarette butts, and sometimes broken glass. Someone even threw up on our mailbox. My dad called the cops almost every weekend, but even when they came, it didn't make a difference. The officers would talk to someone for a few minutes, then leave, and the music would start right back up again. It wasn't just us. The whole neighborhood started to change. People who'd lived there for years began putting up for sale signs. Families who used to barbecue together in the summer stopped going outside. The old couple across the street who used to walk their dog every evening stopped entirely. Everyone got tired of complaining. The cops got tired of responding. It became this background noise that nobody liked, but everyone learned to live with. After about a year, they built this huge garage behind the house. It went up fast. Wood framing, then metal siding, then a solid concrete floor. It didn't look like a regular garage. It was bigger, like something meant for industrial use. There were no windows, just a wide metal door and a few vents. After that, the music changed. You could still hear it, but it was muffled, deeper, more bass than anything else. It was almost worse because it wasn't the kind of noise you could block out. It pulsed through everything. At night, when the street was empty, you could still hear that low thudding sound from inside the garage. Sometimes I'd see trucks pulling into the driveway late at night. Not regular cars, big pickup trucks with cages in the back, sometimes vans. They'd stay for a few hours and then leave. The dogs they kept, at least 4 or 5, barked constantly. You could hear them yelping and growling all hours of the day. My dad thought maybe they were breeding them or something. But after a while, it didn't sound like normal barking. It sounded wrong, angry, painful. The neighborhood just kept getting worse. More break-ins, more noise, more police. People started whispering about things, but nobody really knew what was happening. Every few months, new faces would show up at that house. Sometimes the kids were gone for weeks. The uncle, or whoever he was the one we saw the most. He was always outside smoking, pacing, talking on a phone. The dad looked nervous a lot of the time, like he was always checking around before doing anything. Then one morning, sometime around 2003 or maybe 2004, the whole street woke up to flashing lights. Police cars lined the block, unmarked vehicles, vans, everything. They blocked off both ends of the road. My parents and I stood in our driveway and watched as officers in black uniforms stormed the house. We could hear yelling, dogs barking, doors being slammed open. It went on for hours. They brought out cages from the garage one after another. You could hear the dogs whining inside them. Then boxes, bags, and things that looked like weapons. Later that afternoon, my dad finally got the story from one of the neighbors who talked to an officer. They had been running a dog-fighting ring and trafficking drugs right there in that garage. The garage we thought was just for their loud parties was actually where they trained and fought those dogs. When I realized that, I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds I'd heard at night. The barking, the thudding, the muffled screams. They weren't from the music. They were from the fights. After that, the house sat empty for a long time. The windows were boarded up. The yard grew wild again. Eventually it was sold, but the new owners didn't stay long either. The neighborhood kept changing. There were more sirens, more arguments, more broken windows. Around 2005, my parents decided they'd had enough. My brother and I were older by then, and even we could feel it. The neighborhood wasn't the same. Every streetlight seemed dimmer. Every noise at night felt like trouble. When we moved out, I remember looking back one last time at Mr. Harlan's old house. The paint was faded again, the grass overgrown. It didn't look like the home it used to be. I thought about how peaceful things had been when he was there. how he'd wave every morning when he got his mail, how his porch light was always the first one on when it got dark. I still think about him sometimes, how one person can make a place feel safe just by being there. After he died, it was like the house became hollow, and everything that came after just filled that emptiness with noise and trouble. Maybe it would have all gone downhill anyway. Maybe not. But I know one thing for sure. When he was there, that street had a heart. And when he left, it lost it. We moved on and life went on. But every time I pass an old house with a perfect lawn and a porch light glowing at dusk, I remember that street, that house, and the sound of the coffee cups clinking on Saturday mornings before everything changed. When I was living in Arizona, our house sat at the end of a small cul-de-sac tucked between two others. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple single-story home with faded beige paint and a patchy gravel yard that always looked half done. The sun beat down on that neighborhood like it was punishing us for living there. Every afternoon the asphalt would shimmer with heat, and the air would be thick with that dry, heavy stillness that made you feel slow and tired. You could always smell dust in the air, mixed with the faint burnt scent of hot car metal and oil. To the left of us lived a lesbian couple that everyone in the house started calling Butch and Sundance. The names just sort of stuck after my dad made a joke one day, and from then on, that's what we called them. They were loud, always smoking on their porch, always watching what everyone else was doing. On the other side was this guy we called Beamer Boy. He was the type who thought money made him better than the people around him. He had one of those shiny BMWs that looked freshly waxed every morning, always spotless like it was his pride and joy. The guy kept his lawn perfectly trimmed and had those fake solar lights lining his driveway like he was living in some magazine neighborhood. We weren't like that. We were broke. You could see it in everything we owned. Our front door creaked when you opened it. The mailbox leaned forward like it was tired of standing, and our cars were always in some stage of repair. My dad was always under a hood or covered in grease working on something to keep the cars running. He did everything himself because there was no way we could afford to pay someone else to do it. He took pride in that. He kept a small collection of tools in an old red metal box and a few stained rags hanging over the fence. Most weekends were spent in that driveway, sweating through his shirt covered in oil, fixing something that broke during the week. One afternoon, Beamer Boy snapped. He came out yelling, pointing at my dad, saying he was dragging down property values and ruining the neighborhood's look. My dad didn't yell back. He just kept doing what he was doing, changing the oil on one of our old cars. 15 minutes later, the guy called the cops. The heat was blazing that day, and I remember the shimmer on the road when the patrol car pulled up. The officers were polite, but you could tell they thought the whole thing was ridiculous. They asked my dad if he was dumping oil into the storm drain, checked his tools, looked at the containers, and told him to clean up properly. He always did anyway. They left soon after, but that little incident started everything. After that, Beamer Boy never stopped watching us. If we were outside, he'd be standing by his window, blinds tilted open just enough to see through. You could feel it, the eyes on you. The glass would glint just right and you'd spot him there, motionless. It wasn't just glancing either. He watched every move, every time my dad opened the hood or pulled out the jack stands. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in his driveway, arms crossed, pretending to check his mail while staring at us. It got to the point where we all felt uncomfortable just walking outside. Then Butch and Sundance started to get involved. They had a perfect excuse to jump in, being the type that loved attention. The first time they really went after my dad was when he was replacing the brakes on his car. It was late afternoon, sun dropping low, the air cooling a bit, and my dad was crouched next to the front tire, hands black with grease. Out of nowhere, Butch came storming out, her voice sharp and echoing off the cul-de-sac walls. I remember hearing every word, even from inside. She was furious that he was working on a car in his driveway. It made the neighborhood look trashy, she said. I could see her pacing on her porch, cigarette in one hand, yelling like she had nothing better to do. It was embarrassing. I remember looking out the window and seeing my dad wipe his hands on his rag, standing there calm, while she lost her mind. Of course, the cops showed up again that day. It was almost routine at that point. They asked the same questions, poked around, and left. My dad didn't say much after they left, but I could tell it was eating at him. You could see the exhaustion in the way he moved after that. He started checking the driveway every time he came home, making sure there wasn't a reason for anyone to complain. But it didn't matter. It was like the neighbors were waiting for any excuse. Butch started watching too. She'd stand on her porch with her arms folded across her chest, just watching. Sometimes Sundance would be next to her, not saying much, but you could tell she was in on it too. They both had this smug look, like they'd won something every time a police car drove down the street. It became a pattern. We'd work on a car, they'd watch, then someone would call the cops. It wasn't just about the cars anymore. One day we got a visit from the police saying there'd been a noise complaint about my siblings and me being too loud outside. The problem was all three of us had been at school. It didn't make sense, but it didn't matter. They called anyway just to cause trouble. The tension in that street got so bad that it felt like the air itself was thick with it. You couldn't step outside without feeling watched. Every small sound echoed too loudly. Every little thing we did seemed to be an offense. I'd walk to the mailbox and see blinds shift. It made you paranoid. I remember lying awake at night sometimes, hearing the faint hum of Beamer Boy's car as he idled in his driveway, polishing it or running it just to keep it perfect. It felt like a constant reminder that we didn't belong. The final week before we moved out was the one that really burned into my memory. My dad had sold one of our cars, an old 1982 Corolla wagon, to a friend, but it needed an engine replacement before it could be driven. The plan was to swap engines between two Toyotas. One we had running and another we were scrapping for parts. The entire process should have taken a day, maybe two, but it stretched into a full week. That last week was hot, dusty, and tense. We had both cars parked in the gravel yard, hoods up, parts spread out on the ground. There were metal tools, bolts, old oil containers, rags. Everything laid out neatly, but to anyone else it probably looked like chaos. The smell of gasoline and grease hung in the air all day. Every time my dad started the engine hoist, you could see Butch standing on her porch, phone in hand. Beamer Boy watched from his window, arms crossed, his face tight with annoyance. You could almost feel the anger rolling off him. Sure enough, the cops came out that first day. They looked around, saw what we were doing, and left. They came again 2 days later after another call. Same thing. It became almost funny, the way it kept happening. Like they couldn't stand to see us finishing what we started. But we didn't stop. Every evening as the sun dropped behind the houses, we kept working under a single hanging light bulb. Mosquitoes buzzing around it, the air cooling just enough to keep us going. By the end of the week, the car was done. We wiped everything down, packed up the tools, and parked the finished Toyota on the street for the buyer to pick up. The yard looked cleaner than it ever had before. The gravel raked flat, the stains scrubbed out. It felt like we were finally getting the last laugh, like we'd made it through their constant complaining without letting them win. When the tow truck came to take the car, I remember standing on the porch watching. Butch was there, of course, smoking and pretending not to look. Beamer Boy was behind his window like always, the blinds open just enough. I could see his face reflected in the glass. Neither of them said a word. That was our last day there. That evening, we loaded up the last of our things, shut the front door, and pulled out of that cul-de-sac for good. As we drove away, I looked out the window one last time. The sun was setting, the street bathed in orange light. Beamer Boy's BMW gleamed like a mirror, perfectly clean. Butch was still standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching us leave. There was no yelling that time, no cops, no noise, just silence. It felt heavy, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath until we were gone. As soon as we turned the corner, I let out a long exhale I didn't even know I was holding. It was finally over. All those long afternoons, the heat, the stares, the phone calls, they faded as the distance grew between us and that place. The farther we drove, the lighter it felt, like we were shedding something that had been pressing down on us for too long. We didn't talk about those neighbors again after that. But sometimes, even years later, I still think about that cul-de-sac, how small it was, how quiet it looked from the outside, and how much ugliness was packed into that silence. It taught me something about people, that some of the worst kinds of neighbors aren't the loud ones or the ones who make a mess. It's the ones who watch, waiting for you to slip, ready to call someone else to deal with you. The ones who make you feel like you're living under glass. Leaving that place wasn't just moving out. It was finally being free of the feeling that we didn't belong, and for the first time in a long while, the air felt clean again. I used to have neighbors from hell living right behind my house. Started a few years ago during early spring. They moved in quietly at first, a family of 4. The parents were middle-aged, rough around the edges, and they had a teenage son who looked like the kind of kid that never smiled. Their backyard shared a fence with mine, just a tall, old wooden fence that separated the 2 properties. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them. I kept to myself, mowed my lawn, tended my small garden, and tried to enjoy my weekends outside when the weather was nice. Then one morning, I walked out to the back of my yard and saw something strange. There was trash scattered near my shed. Not a ton of it, but enough to notice. Crumpled plastic bottles, a broken toy car, and what looked like the torn remains of a cereal box. I thought maybe an animal dragged it in overnight. The wind sometimes carried garbage from the street too. I didn't think too much about it. I cleaned it up, bagged it, and moved on. A few days later, more trash showed up. Different stuff this time. An old flip-flop, a cracked plastic plate, and what looked like the stuffing from a pillow. That's when I noticed that the fence line behind my shed had a few gaps between the boards. On the other side was their yard. I couldn't see much, but I caught a glimpse of a blue plastic trash bin tipped over. Figured maybe they were careless or their bin got knocked by wind or raccoons. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, but it kept happening. Every week something new appeared. Bags of household garbage, random junk, paper plates, broken toys, food wrappers. Once I even found a used diaper near the base of the fence. That's when it became clear that it wasn't an accident. Someone was actually throwing trash over. I started checking the yard more often, and every time I did, I'd find something. Always in the same area behind the shed. I decided to start throwing it back. I'd pick up the trash, walk to the fence, and toss it right back over. I didn't say anything, didn't make a scene, just returned what wasn't mine. For a little while I thought it worked, but then a few days later it all came back, some of the same pieces. I recognized a red soda can I had tossed back earlier sitting in my grass again. It was like they were deliberately waiting until I cleaned it up, then threw it back over just to get under my skin. That summer was especially hot, and I spent a lot of time in the backyard working on the garden. I'd be sweating in the sun, trying to keep my plants alive, and I could hear them behind the fence. The father was rarely around, but the mother was always outside yelling at the son, and the son blasted music so loud it made the fence shake. He worked on his car in the driveway all day long, some beat-up old sedan with no muffler that he revved constantly. The bass from his music would rattle my windows. Sometimes I'd be inside trying to watch TV, and I could still feel it vibrating in my chest. Then they got a basketball hoop. They set it up in their driveway and would play for hours, day and night. The thudding of the ball, the hollow echo when it hit the pavement, the sharp clang of it hitting the rim. It went on endlessly. It wasn't just the sound. It was the constant yelling, the shouting, the loud arguments. They'd have friends over too. Cars parked along the street, music blasting. It got to the point where I could tell which nights they'd be up late, just by how the air felt. The hum of the subwoofer, the faint reek of cigarette smoke drifting over the fence. By the middle of summer, I'd stopped using my backyard as much. Every time I went out there, I'd find new trash. Sometimes it was small stuff, bottle caps, fast food wrappers. Other times it was more deliberate. A half-empty soda can, a piece of an old toy, even a slice of moldy bread. I started to wonder if they were doing it just to get a reaction out of me. It wasn't just annoying anymore. It felt personal. One day I went out to mow the lawn and saw something big lying in the grass near the front side of the yard. It was the old basketball hoop and backboard. They just dumped it there, right on the edge of my property like it was nothing. The backboard was cracked, the rim bent, the base still half filled with sand. They literally just dragged it from their driveway into my yard and left it. I couldn't believe it. I pushed it back against the fence, right up against their side, thinking maybe they'd realize what they did. The next morning it was back in my yard again. I hadn't even heard them move it. Somehow, overnight or early morning, they'd dragged it right back. It became this silent standoff. Me pushing it back over, them dumping it again. I tried moving it farther up along the fence, but no matter what I did, it kept showing up again. It felt like a game I didn't agree to play. By late August, my yard looked like a war zone. I started dreading going out there. Every time I did, I'd find something new. Once I found a pile of cigarette butts and a torn-up stuffed animal that looked like it had been soaked in something. The smell around the shed got worse too. It wasn't rotting trash exactly, just a faint sour odor that hung in the air whenever the sun hit that part of the yard. I remember standing out there one day, sweat dripping down my back, looking at all the junk littered across the grass, and realizing how powerless it made me feel. It was my property, my space, and I couldn't even enjoy it without dealing with their garbage. When fall came, things didn't get better. The kids still blasted music, though less often as school started again. I'd see them sometimes out front, the mom smoking, the dad barely speaking. The fence stayed the same, weathered and stained, but I knew what was happening behind it. Trash still came over now and then, though less frequent. It was almost like they'd gotten bored with it. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or just more uneasy. Then one day in early winter, I noticed the house behind mine looked quiet. The car in the driveway was gone. No music, no yelling, nothing. For a few days, I didn't hear a thing. I thought maybe they were on vacation. But by the end of the week, I saw a moving truck pull up. They were leaving. Just like that. No warning, no word, no nothing. I watched from my kitchen window as they loaded up boxes and furniture. I half expected them to dump something in my yard one last time. Some final insult before going. But they didn't. After they left, I went out to the backyard. The grass was brown from the cold, the garden dead, the air still. I walked all the way to the back fence and stood there for a while. It was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. No music, no shouting, no engine noises. Just silence. The fence looked old, like it had aged twice as fast as the rest of the yard. But for the first time, there wasn't a single piece of trash on the ground. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and just listened. It was peaceful. The kind of peace I didn't realize I'd been missing. Over the next few days, I cleaned the yard completely. Raked, mowed, filled a few garbage bags with the last bits of junk that had been buried under the grass. I even repainted the shed. By the time I was done, it looked like my yard again. The new people who moved in behind me a few months later were quiet. They kept their yard clean, waved when they saw me, and never caused a problem. The trash never came back. The basketball hoop never reappeared. It was like the air around the fence had cleared. Every so often, when I go out to mow or pull weeds near the back, I still think about those neighbors. About how something so small, a bit of trash, can turn into years of frustration and tension. It sounds trivial when you try to explain it, but living through it, it eats at you. The constant noise, the disrespect, the small, daily reminders that someone doesn't care about the space you're trying to keep decent. Now, when I walk out there and the yard is clean and still, I appreciate it more than I ever did before. The quiet isn't just sound, it's relief. It's the feeling that the worst kind of chaos can finally move on, leaving you to breathe again. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. The houses were all the same shape and distance apart, each with a small patch of yard and chain-link fences that had started to rust with age. It wasn't fancy, but it was steady. Families stayed for years. The same faces walking dogs, mowing lawns, washing cars on Sundays. It felt like the kind of place nothing really bad could happen in. That's probably why it took me so long to realize just how wrong that was. The house next door had always been strange. When I was little, I remember it being a quiet place with a retired couple who kept to themselves. They had a vegetable garden in the back and a swing that creaked every time the wind passed through. But after they moved out, the place seemed cursed. Every new tenant that came in brought some new kind of trouble. Fights in the driveway, broken windows, shouting matches at 2 a.m. You could tell even as a kid that the house carried bad energy. When I was around 10, the first big thing happened. It was summer, and the air was heavy and hot. I remember the smell of smoke before I even heard the sirens. I ran outside with my mom, and the house next door was on fire. Thick black smoke rolled up into the sky, and orange light pulsed in the windows. We stood on the lawn as the fire trucks came, lights flashing red against the white paint of our house. Someone said it started because the teenage boys living there were melting pennies with a lighter or something stupid like that. I remember thinking how insane that sounded, but the adults nodded like it made sense. The fire didn't destroy the whole house, but the roof was scorched and the front windows were gone. After that, the place sat empty for a long time, dark and quiet, except for the occasional raccoon rustling around. About 2 years later, the house sold again, this time to a group of people, a few men and a woman. I remember the day they moved in because there were a lot of cars. Trucks mostly, with cages and tools in the back. They weren't the kind of people who waved hello or tried to make small talk. They just moved their things in and kept to themselves. They didn't fix the yard or paint the porch like new homeowners usually do. The grass grew long, weeds climbing up through the cracks in the driveway. It was early spring when I first saw the dogs. I walked out into my backyard one Saturday morning, the air still cool from the night, and there they were, 6 little pit bull puppies running around the yard next door. Their mother was off near the back fence lying in a patch of dirt. The puppies were all different shades of brown and gray, tiny and clumsy, their ears still floppy. They looked so harmless back then, chasing each other and tumbling over their own feet. One of them, the smallest one, caught my eye. He was lighter in color than the rest, almost silvery brown. He noticed me standing by the fence and waddled over, his little tail wagging so hard it threw him off balance. I laughed and crouched down to watch him. Every time I moved along the fence, he'd run after me, yipping and tripping over the uneven grass. Sometimes he'd sit and just stare at me like he was trying to figure me out. I never got close enough to touch him, but for a while, I saw him almost every day. As the weeks passed, things around that house got weirder. The men would be out late, their trucks pulling in and out at all hours of the night. I'd hear dogs barking, not just the puppies but deeper, rougher sounds, the kind that came from grown dogs with throats hoarse from use. It wasn't the kind of barking you hear when a dog sees a squirrel. It sounded like anger, like pain. Sometimes it came from inside the garage, muffled but sharp enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. Police cars started coming around more often. Sometimes they'd drive slow down the street. Other times they'd stop right in front of that house and sit there for a while before leaving. My parents would look out the window and talk quietly to each other, but they never said much to me about it. I overheard my dad once telling someone on the phone that those people were bad news. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time. Over the months, the number of puppies I saw outside got smaller. First there were 6, then 4, then 2. I'd ask my mom if she thought they gave them away, but she'd just shrug and tell me to stay out of their yard. Eventually, only the little one, the silvery brown one, was left. He'd grown bigger, stronger, and the way he looked at me changed. His eyes were still curious, but there was something else behind them, something harder. One afternoon, I saw one of the men in their backyard with the dog. I was sitting on our back steps, and through the thin steel fence I could see everything. The man had a stick in his hand, and he was using it to shove the dog, yelling at him to attack something I couldn't see. The dog barked and growled, lunging forward every time he was hit. It went on for a long time. I couldn't move. It didn't look like training. It looked like cruelty. I didn't understand why anyone would do that to an animal that used to be so small and sweet. After that day, I never saw the dog the same way again. When he was left outside alone, he'd come up to the fence, teeth showing, saliva dripping from his mouth, growling low in his throat. It wasn't the same playful bark from before. It was warning. I stopped going into the backyard for a while, after he lunged at the fence one afternoon. The sound of him slamming against it made me jump back so fast I fell. The fence sagged inward from where he hit it, the metal bending slightly toward our yard. My mom almost got caught by him one afternoon. She was trimming the bushes along the fence line when the dog came out of nowhere, charging full speed. The fence bowed under his weight, rattling hard enough that it sounded like it might break. My mom screamed and stumbled back, dropping the trimmer. I remember the sound of the dog snarling, his jaws snapping just inches away. She managed to grab the can of pepper spray she carried and sprayed through the fence. The dog yelped and ran off. After that, we avoided that side of the yard completely. There were nights I'd wake up to the sound of barking and whining. Sometimes it went on for hours, the kind of noises that made it impossible to sleep. Other times, I'd hear engines idling in the driveway next door, voices murmuring low, and the faint metallic sound of cages being moved. Once I saw the woman dragging a large tarp across the yard early in the morning. It was too dark to see what was underneath it, and then one day they were gone. It happened without warning. One morning I woke up and noticed how quiet it was. No barking, no trucks. When I looked out the window, the driveway was empty. The curtains in their windows were drawn back, and the front door was slightly open. My dad went to check the mail that afternoon and said it looked like they'd moved out overnight. Just disappeared. The yard was a mess. Trash, broken glass, old cages piled up behind the shed. For a while I kept looking out back, half expecting to see that dog again, but the yard stayed empty. The grass grew tall, the wind blowing through it like waves. I don't know where they went, but I never saw the dog again either. After a few weeks, the city sent someone to clean up the property. They took out the trash, boarded up the back windows, and put up a notice on the door. It stayed empty for months. Then one day another new family moved in, a man, his wife, and their 2 kids. They painted the house a fresh coat of white and mowed down the weeds. It looked normal again, almost peaceful, but I couldn't forget what had happened there. Sometimes when I was out in our yard, I'd still look at that spot where the fence sagged inward, the exact place that dog had hit over and over again. The metal never straightened out. It stayed bent toward our side like a scar that wouldn't fade. As I got older, I learned what really went on in houses like that. Dog fighting. I didn't understand the word when I was 12, but now I do. The training, the cages, the noises in the night, all of it made sense. Those men had been breeding and fighting dogs right next door to us, and all that time, I was just a kid watching it unfold without knowing. It's strange how memory works. Out of everything, the thing that sticks with me most isn't the barking or the fear, or even the night the fire trucks came again years later for some unrelated call. It's that one small moment. The image of that puppy running along the fence line, chasing me back and forth, his tail wagging, his tiny paws kicking up dust. I can still see his face, round and innocent, before it all changed. There's something deeply wrong about watching something pure get ruined by cruelty. It stays with you. I think about that dog more often than I should. Sometimes when I hear barking in the distance, my mind goes straight back to that house. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new owners are good people. They keep their yard clean, decorate for holidays, wave when they see us. But no matter how nice it looks, I can't stand too close to that fence for long. There's still a faint dent in the dirt under the sagging metal, like a mark left by years of paws slamming into it. I'll catch myself standing there sometimes, staring at that spot. The sound of wind through the fence makes this soft, hollow whistle. Every time it does, I remember that dog's eyes. Bright, desperate, turned mean because someone made him that way. It's been years since they left, but that memory never really did. When people talk about bad neighbors, they mean loud music or trash left on the lawn. But I know what real bad neighbors are. I know what it feels like to live next to something evil. hidden behind a thin strip of metal and a patch of grass. And even though that house looks normal now, every time I walk past it, I still see flashes of that yard the way it was. The cages, the dirt, the movement of small paws, the sound of growls cutting through the air. I think about that puppy that used to chase me, and how one day he stopped. Some nights, when the wind is low and everything is still, I can almost imagine hearing a faint rustle near the back fence. It's not real, I know that, but it feels like a reminder that even in quiet places, even in neighborhoods that look perfect from the outside, there are things that rot behind the walls, things that don't leave just because the people do. The house next door has been painted over, repaired, and lived in by kind families since then. But no matter how much time passes, I can't forget what was once there. The sound, the smell, the look of that poor dog, the way innocence can turn to hate when it's forced to. That's the thing about bad neighbors. They leave, but what they do never really goes away. It lingers in the air, in the ground, and in the memories of the people who were there to see it. I was only 12, but I still remember every sound, every shadow. Every night I lay awake listening to those muffled growls through the walls of my room, and I'll never forget how. One morning I looked out at an empty yard and realized that sometimes the scariest kind of evil isn't the one that stays. It's the one that leaves, and leaves nothing behind but silence. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, the kind of place where you could tell what time it was by the sounds outside. Sirens, engines revving, dogs barking, and sometimes gunshots echoing off the old brick buildings. It wasn't the worst part of the city, but it was close enough. Houses sat close together, yards divided by chain-link fences, most of them leaning from years of neglect. The air always smelled faintly like motor oil, cigarette smoke, and asphalt dust. When you live in a place like that, neighbors mean everything. They can either make your life easier or make it hell. You've got your ghost neighbors, the ones you never see. Blinds always shut. Their car maybe moves once a week. Then there are the neighbors from hell. The ones who scream all night, let their dogs loose, or have sketchy people showing up at all hours. And then there are the rare ones who look out for you. The kind that actually make you feel safe. You hold on to those people. On the right side of our house was one of those ghost neighbors. A quiet older guy who rarely came out, maybe retired, maybe just tired of everything. After a few years, he started talking to my mom, helping her carry groceries, offering tools when something broke. He turned out to be decent. On the left were my godparents. They were family to us, the kind of people who would show up at your door with food when money was tight. Across the street was a different story. That house belonged to a family of meth addicts. You could tell by the constant yelling, the random people showing up at all hours, the windows that were always covered with mismatched sheets instead of curtains. They had 3 kids, and somehow those kids always looked clean even though the parents were a mess. The mom would sometimes wander the street barefoot at night, screaming at no one. But the house that really defined the street sat 2 doors down from them, on the corner. That was where Tweaker Dan lived. Everyone called him that, or the white guy. I never knew his real last name. He was white, middle-aged, shaved head, always greasy from car work. His garage door was almost never closed. He ran what he called a garage, but everyone knew it was more than that. He worked on cars, sure, old Hondas, pickup trucks, motorcycles. But it was also where half the drug trade in the neighborhood happened. Dan's garage started buzzing at around 5 in the morning every single day. He'd have engines idling, music playing low, the clinking of wrenches echoing across the block. He worked until midnight most nights. People came and went constantly. Some just stopped by to talk. Others handed him envelopes, others left looking shaky and paranoid. He didn't hide what he was doing. Everyone knew, but no one called the cops. That's the thing about neighborhoods like that. You don't call the cops unless you have to. People learn to handle things their own way. When I was a kid, I was scared of Dan. Everyone was. He was unpredictable. Sometimes he'd be laughing and friendly, waving at everyone who passed by. Other times you'd hear him yelling at someone in his driveway, and it would end with the other person speeding off or walking away fast, muttering under their breath. And every so often you'd hear something worse. Gunshots, shouting, tires squealing. I remember one night I was about 10, lying in bed with the window open because it was hot. Around midnight I heard a loud argument. Two men yelling. One of them was definitely Dan. There was this sudden pause, then a single gunshot. The sound bounced down the street. My mom ran into my room, told me to stay away from the window. When we looked outside a few minutes later, all the lights on the street were off except for Dan's garage light. A black car peeled away from the corner, and then everything went silent again. No police came. Nobody said anything. The next morning, Dan was out there like nothing had happened, wrenching on an engine, waving to my godfather as he drove by. That's how things were. The strange part was, Dan wasn't a bad neighbor to the people who lived there long term. He waved to everyone. Every morning, if you were outside, you'd get that wave from him as he rode past on his bike. He had a car, a beat-up Monte Carlo, but he rarely used it. He rode that same black mountain bike everywhere. He'd pedal down the street, nodding at people, sometimes stopping to talk. As a kid, I thought maybe he was just being friendly. Later, I realized it was something else. He was watching. That wave wasn't about being polite. It was him keeping tabs. He noticed every car that didn't belong. Every person who walked through that didn't live there. He made it clear that he knew who you were. And it worked. People didn't mess around on our street. It wasn't until I got older that I started to really understand what he was doing. When I was about 18, I ended up hanging around some mutual friends who knew more about that side of things. That's when I learned Dan wasn't just some local meth dealer. He was part of the local supply chain, high up enough that the gangs respected him. Our neighborhood was right in between two gang territories, both dangerous, both big enough that if they wanted, they could have taken the area over easily. But they didn't, and it was because of Dan he supplied them both. He had an arrangement with them. They could buy from him, but they stayed out of the neighborhood. His rule was simple. Don't bring your problems where you live. Don't bring heat to his street. He sold to them, but that came with boundaries. If anyone violated those boundaries, they'd regret it. I didn't realize at the time that his friendliness was the thing keeping us safe. That bike, the constant waving, the early morning garage work, it wasn't random. It was surveillance. He was always awake, always aware. He was the closest thing to law enforcement we had, in a twisted way. And it worked. For all the crime in the city, our block was strangely stable. The weirdest part was that some of the people you'd least expect were friendly with him. My godfather, for instance. He was a solid man. Worked at the post office, paid his taxes, never touched drugs. But he'd wave back at Dan, sometimes stop by the garage. I asked him once, years later, how he could be okay with that guy. He told me, "You just don't talk about certain things. You just know what's what." I think about that a lot now. How some people understand that not all order comes from law. Some comes from fear, from balance, from people like Dan. When Dan died, the street changed fast. It was sudden heart attack, they said. Probably from years of drug use, no surprise there. He was found in his garage, half under a car, still holding a wrench. They said he was working on someone's truck when it happened. Within a month, things fell apart. The house across the street got raided. The meth family moved out or got evicted. Within 6 months, new people moved in. Loud ones, different gangs, different rules. You could hear gunshots again at night, only now they didn't stop at one. The cops started showing up more often, not because people trusted them, but because there was no one else left to keep order. When I drive through that street now, years later, it doesn't look the same. Some of the houses are boarded up. The chain-link fences are rusted, the yard's overgrown. Dan's garage is gone. Someone turned it into a 2-bedroom rental. You'd never know what it once was, what he once did. But every time I pass that corner, I still picture him sitting there on his old bike, one hand on the handlebars, the other raised in that half-wave he gave to everyone. It wasn't a friendly wave, not really. It was a reminder. He was saying, "I see you," and maybe that's what kept everything from falling apart for so long. Not the police, not the city, not any law or rule. Just one man who refused to let chaos touch his street. People like to paint criminals as pure evil, but where I grew up, it wasn't that simple. Sometimes the worst people did the most good without meaning to. Sometimes a man like Dan, loud, dangerous, unpredictable, ended up being the only reason kids like me could sleep through the night. When I think of neighbors, I still think of him. The sound of his tools clinking before dawn, the faint music from his garage, the rumble of engines, the smell of oil in the summer air, the sight of that bike light cutting through the dark as he rode past, making sure the street stayed quiet. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't good, but for a long time he kept the bad from getting worse. And in a place like that, that counted for something.